Hello and welcome to the Moyo Show. This is episode 5, and today is going to be a slightly different episode. We're going to be quite information dense. This is going to be quite a dense one today. I'm going to try and get through it relatively quickly, but also there's a lot here, so be prepared for that. You may also notice that I'm going to be darting down my eyes. If you're watching the video version of this, if you're watching the audio version, you won't notice, but I'm going to be darting down my eyes quite a bit to look at my notes, make sure I have things set up correctly. I'm just going to quickly set my phone to do not disturb because we have learnt that lesson before. And let's get started. So, yes, today's episode is on multiplayer. It's the history of multiplayer. Multiplayer doesn't tend to be separated from sort of the history of video games, and I really wanted to explore who the most important people were, what the most important games were, the most important technology throughout the history of multiplayer, and sort of frame it in all of the sort of big picture groups of methods of multiplayer. So we're going to cover split screen, shared screen, and then we're going to go on to sort of basic networking, and then beyond that we'll start looking at sort of LAN parties and the era of server browsers, and then we're going to look at the modern stuff, coming into esports and coming into like hero shooters and battle royales and live services. So that is today's goal. To start off, as we do every single week, I'm going to recommend a slightly different recommendation. I'm going to recommend a slightly different video than usual, because this week's video is quite information dense, and it's going to cover networking a bit. If you find any of the more nuanced stuff, more details oriented stuff interesting, and you want to learn more about it, and you may want to explore networking more generally, Network Chuck has an excellent CCNA course. CCNA stands for Cisco Certified Network Associate. It's the certificate I got when I went to do networking at university. And his course is just a great way to learn about the fundamentals of networking. He frames the very first episode in this really great way where he sort of talks through the playing a video game and shooting someone, and how that bullet travels through the network to the server, back through the internet to his brother who he shot. Excellent video, so I really, really recommend that. Next week's episode will probably be on the history of trailers, gameplay, showcases, teasers, stuff like that, especially given Rockstar's most recent announcement of an extended look for GTA 6, which this past week has sort of come into the news and has been quite interesting. Especially the most important part of that for me is that it's a Netflix exclusive, which is the first time in all of gaming history, as far as I can tell, that a trailer has been exclusive to a streaming platform. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting situation. I sort of want to look into that further, so next week will probably be on sort of the history of trailers and that stuff. Alright, I don't think there's anything else to do before we get started. So the very first section, let me set my timer. We're going to try and keep it to 10 minutes per section, and we're gonna try and get through it nice and smoothly. All right. So, local era. So, sort of the very early days of the creation of multiplayer, and then very, very early simple networks. Split screens, and sort of the first times we had casual, cooperative, stuff like that. So the very first game I want to look at in this section is the absolute beginning. It's the start. It's where this concept of multiplayer first has a playable example of what multiplayer is. It was a game called Tennis for Two. Now, if you know anything about the history of video games, you know what Tennis for Two is. Tennis for Two was created in October of 1958 by a William Higginbotham. He was a nuclear physicist at Brookhaven National Laboratory. It was created on a Donner Model 30 analog computer. And it was created for Brookhaven National Laboratory's annual Visitors Day. Tennis for Two is basically, if you look into it, it's basically considered the first video game. Or at least the first video game designed for purely entertainment. Higginbotham programmed the physics of a bouncing ball when he realized that the Donner Model 30 could basically do trajectories, it can do wind resistance. So he did this ball and he displayed it on a 5-inch, somewhere around there, 5-inch cathode ray oscilloscope, which was basically a round screen that just had like dots of light that could move around pretty nicely because it was a cathode ray tube. And he created it for this Visitors Day, and then visitors played using these custom-built aluminum controllers that had a dial, which would adjust your angle of return for the ball. So the ball would go over, and you would change the dial to adjust what angle you hit the ball at. And there was a button, and that would hit the ball, and you could hit the ball back and forward. And you would have two. There were two controllers, and two people could play at the same time. This was a massive hit. They had like huge lines of attendees trying to play this game. It was one of the first instances where the public could experience playing on a machine rather than just looking at one and sort of oh, look at that thing that can show a thing on a screen. It's like, actually, here's the first time you can have fun with a computer. And simultaneously, not only was it one of the first video games ever created, most of the games, by the way, before were, I believe, mostly created as like demos. They weren't meant to actually be played. They were sort of just to show what the hardware could do. So you could argue if they were video games, but this almost certainly was a video game. But despite that, it's also due to the fact that you could have two people playing, it was unintentionally also the first multiplayer game. And it's in the name, Tennis for Two. It was created so that two people could play tennis. So, Higginbotham is a really interesting character, because Bill was not a computer scientist. As mentioned, he's a nuclear physicist. He worked at Los Alamos during World War II, as part of the Manhattan Project. He was sort of part of that era of scientists where they could sort of be a part of any part of the science field. It was more of a general term rather than a specific study of focus. So while he was considered now a nuclear physicist, he was more just a scientist who understood nuclear physics and understood how to use computers. Now, we're going to skip over a lot of history now. We're sort of skipping over ColecoVision and television, and I'm going to take us straight to the Atari ST, which was a personal computer released in 1985. And there is a game called MIDI Maze. It was also known as Faceball 2000, but nonetheless, it was created by Xanth Software in 1987. And MIDI Maze is sort of the unsung grandfather of first-person shooter deathmatch. So, rather than requiring specialized network hardware, which was starting to become a thing at the time, developers basically hijacked the Atari ST in such a way that they used the built-in MIDI ports, a port designed for, sequencing digital synths and keyboards and things like that, drum machines. And basically they took the MIDI input and output and they wired the MIDI input of one Atari ST to the MIDI in of the next. And then they did it one by one and they went around and they created what's called a daisy chain, because you're connecting the MIDI ports of all the computers. So this sort of clever workaround, it let them play with 16 players, connecting all of these computers together, and it was effectively the invention of the LAN party, nearly a decade before Doom or Quake. So, researching that was quite cool, because, they didn't have, as far as I'm aware, they didn't use any standard protocols. They had to create their own networking protocols to deal with this ring of computers, in order to scale up and scale down from 2 computers connected to each other to 16 computers connected to each other in this ring. And they had to handle passing the data around this chain in such a way that the game would feel like they're all just connected to each other, rather than the data actually having to go through all of these other computers before it got back. It's a really interesting concept, so I recommend, if you want to learn more, go and look into it. It's quite interesting. This section is going to go slightly over, so I have to drop some bits off of another section. But the next innovation I want to talk about is, again, another bit of a jump. It's about 10 years after MIDI Maze, and I want to talk about split screen, one of the most influential split screen games of all time. Which was GoldenEye 007. Released in August of 1997. Martin Hollis, game director, Steve Ellis, programmer. Created by Rare for the Nintendo 64. Split screen multiplayer for GoldenEye 007 was programmed in 1 month by Steve Ellis, who was a programmer on the project. He pushed the N64's 4 megabytes of RAM to its absolute limits. Rendering 4 independent 3D viewports required just a ridiculous amount of geometry culling, removal of the single player lighting and shadow calculations. The intense increase in rendering completely bottlenecked the console's anti-aliasing and Z-buffering, and the frame rate would often tank to below 15 FPS during explosions and heavy firefights. But despite these severe performance constraints, established the technical blueprint for 3D console shooters. I remember even years and years later with modern shooters, more modern shooters, like Modern Warfare 2 back on the PS3, being able to play that split screen. That was just a really cool thing, to be able to play with your friends a game like that, without games coming before it, and sort of creating this expectation of the ability to play multiplayer split screen. People who only had one console in their immediate family wouldn't have ever experienced the ability to play these games with more than one person. The idea of constantly controller sharing would have just stuck around forever. Okay, and the last set of games I want to talk about for this local multiplayer topic is casual games. The sort of introduction of games that could sort of be played by anyone. You didn't have to have the technical knowledge. You didn't have to be a nerd to play these games. And the games I want to talk about are SingStar, released in May of 2004 by London Studio for the PS2, and Buzz, October 2005, Relentless Software for the PlayStation 2. In this era, you have to remember that the PlayStation 2 was basically securing total market dominance. And Sony realized that one of the biggest barriers to even more customers and even more interest from the public for game sales was the limitation of having to use the controller, having to learn how to use analog sticks and the D-pad and the buttons. And a lot of people found it quite intimidating. A lot of non-gamers found it intimidating to deal with any games on PlayStation 2. So, in order to capture the sort of casual party-going demographic, Sony bypassed the DualShock. They went and they made some custom USB peripherals. For SingStar, it was the heavy, realistic feeling dual microphones that they shipped with the game, which would sort of judge a player on how they were singing. And then with Buzz, it utilized a set of 4 simple controllers that had a big red button at the top and then the 4 colored buttons for your options. And Buzz was sort of like a in your house quiz show. So when the question comes up, in order to answer it, you hit the big red button like it's Jeopardy, where you're pushing the little handheld remote, and then to answer it, you push the colored button on the remote that corresponds with the answer that you want to give. This basically transformed the console into a in-home karaoke machine. It transformed it into a digital game show, and it did so with simple controls. Sony successfully lowered the barrier of entry, and it gave many parents and siblings and people who would never have played video games or never have played a multiplayer game their first multiplayer experience, if not their first gaming experience. And this was years before the Nintendo Wii sort of brought the whole concept of motion controls to the living room in order to sort of entice the casual audience. In my opinion, it's sort of the birthplace of a lot of modern casual gaming. For example, Jackbox Party Pack is one of the best multiplayer games of all time. It's basically Buzz. Obviously with a bit more of a spin to it. Every game is quite unique, and the Jackbox people thought everyone knows how to use a smartphone. It's part of everyday life now. So let's turn that into the controller. And even SingStar has now gone down that route. SingStar, I believe the last version of SingStar I saw was one where you used your phone as the microphone. So it's been quite a shift in the industry. Now, unfortunately, I would argue that shared screen multiplayer, at least in the sort of more traditional sense of split screens and shared screen experiences, have sort of fallen out of favor due to the proliferation of independent screens for people. I think that there is still a place for local shared screen multiplayer, simple multiplayer in our gaming world, and I would love to see some more developers sort of tackle multiplayer in unique ways. Okay, 10 minutes for this one. We're gonna stick to it. So, the IPX SPX LAN boom. So it's quite a bit of word salad, but we'll get into it. So in December 1993, John Carmack, lead programmer at id Software, was working on Doom for MS-DOS. It was released, and then it had a multiplayer. It was a revolutionary multiplayer. It used IPX-SPX, which was a protocol that was sort of standard for local networks at the time, and IPX was highly efficient for local play. It sort of relied on broadcast packets, so the computer would just scream out onto the network what is happening in the game, and every other computer on the network would simultaneously take it in. Even if the computer wasn't playing the game, it would sort of look at it, see, is this important for me, and then discard it. But the protocol is sort of inherently unroutable, so there was no way to sort of do general connections over the internet using it. There were tunneling systems like Kali at the time where you could tunnel two networks together, and then the broadcasted packets would just share between the two networks, but it wasn't an ideal situation. And because players couldn't just simply dial in to play together natively, the specific network limitation sort of birthed this culture of the physical LAN party, mostly out of necessity, and it forced players to sort of lug their heavy CRT monitors and their good old beige desktops and go over to each other's houses and in order to truly do the 4-player deathmatch and to experience the multiplayer of Doom. But John Carmack wasn't done there. In 1996, a little game called Quake was released, and at the end of 1996, an update called Quake World. With Quake World, they basically recognized that IPX as a broadcast system, was a broadcast protocol, would not scale for the new internet, this new burgeoning dial-up internet. So Carmack sort of realized a massive shift was needed. And while the base Quake game did support TCP/IP, the subsequent Quake World update was client-side prediction. It basically could, instead of waiting for the latency of it could be like 300 milliseconds for a remote server to confirm movement from another player, your PC could just sort of figure out based on what the player has done to predict mathematically where they're going, what they're doing, and it was accurate enough that it could render the movements almost instantly, and it would snap back if the prediction was incorrect or if the server disagreed with the prediction. But this innovation meant that network lag didn't really hurt your experience. Sure, there would be a couple of times where you would have players who would move, and then the server, your computer would realize, oh, I completely messed that up, and then what should have been a kill is sort of ruined. But the introduction of it meant that you didn't have players who would sort of jump around when they were moving. You got to experience other players moving in a somewhat realistic way, making it feel like what they did was directly, very quickly interacting with what you were doing, even though that wasn't the case. It was just very clever predictions. And it was the birthplace of high octane, fast paced first person shooters that were playable over the internet. It was a truly innovative experience for gamers. Okay, so the next section is on MMOs. I'm going to keep this part relatively short. I don't think I can speak authoritatively really at all on MMOs. I've never really engaged with them. I remember playing World of Warcraft back in the day, so I don't want to speak to them too much on sort of the gameplay and that stuff. I want to sort of keep it focused on the networking infrastructure stuff for MMOs. So, widely considered sort of the first MMO of all time, Ultima Online, released in September of 1997. Game directed by Richard Garriott and Star Long as associate producer. It was created by Origin Systems for PC, and it was the game had unprecedented scale. Which is sort of, it's a staple of MMOs, having a huge number of players. It could scale from 16-player deathmatch to thousands of concurrent players. It was a just huge shift in network engineering. Developers had to move away from peer-to-peer. or single host setups and had to move towards highly complicated, really, carefully put together clustered server environments, having many servers talk to each other, managing game states, managing database states, keeping things, managing things constantly, and syncing persistent changes. This was to ensure player inventories were maintained, to ensure player built housing was always the same between servers, and they had a complex and fluctuating economy in the game, which had to remain intact and secure and persistent when users logged off. And in the history of MMOs, sort of Ultima Online is these days, it's sort of the grandfather of it, but it's not really well remembered by a lot of people. The game that is well remembered was sort of when it became mainstream, when Blizzard created World of Warcraft. November 2004, lead designer Rob Pardo, and creator for PC and Mac, and the game, it heavily refined what Ultima Online had done and what other MMOs had done. It basically took the server architecture and just polished it to an absolute T. World of Warcraft transformed that sort of highly technical, hardcore genre, and was able to remove a lot of the sharp edges for more casual consumers, and it became a global cultural phenomenon for the gaming community. From the perspective of the back end of this whole system, it was revolutionary server management. Blizzard was popularizing the concept of instancing, dynamically generating sort of these unique copies of specific dungeons or zones for individual groups of players, and then this design was so clever that it massively reduced computational and bandwidth load on sort of the main open world servers. It meant that they could very easily spin up very lightweight and very efficient servers for handling the more complex, detailed areas, while keeping the open world servers free from these other workloads. This provided massive simultaneous prevention of severe overcrowding in high traffic areas. This approach smoothed out all of the experiences for players. It massively reduced the chances of server crashes. It allowed millions of subscribers to play concurrently without the underlying infrastructure collapsing under its own user base. It was really, really impressive work, and World of Warcraft is still going today and still has some of the most high quality instance management and server management of any video game, of any multiplayer. Now we get into slightly more modern concepts. So, esports and the death of the server browser. We're going to talk about Counter-Strike, and then we're going to talk about Halo 2. First, the birth of esports absolutely started with Counter-Strike. November 2000 was when the game went retail. Min Lee and Jess Cliff, the creators. It was originally a mod built on Valve's Gold Source engine. Then Valve sort of brought them into the company to make it a proper game on its own in Gold Source. And they released it on PC, and it was huge. It was incredibly popular. The game's popularity was explosive. It drove a massive rise of community-funded, dedicated servers. In these dedicated community servers, sort of popularized using remote console administration, so you could, allow trusted players to enforce the rules of the map and of your server, to change the map at any time, to ban cheaters, and the game's sort of hyper Twitch-based nature, it made it a critical importance for a focus on how the game would figure out when things have happened, and ensure that things only happen at certain times, so the game could be kept fair and could be kept synced between server and client and stuff like that. So the concept of tick rates, which sort of would, you could think of them as like a metronome that would run at like 64 times or 128 times per second, and this really high this tick rate would allow the integrity of competitive play, as well as sort of pixel perfect synchronization between client and server, making hit registration gold standard. It made competitive play, it was sort of the gold standard for how to do competitive shooters, and the popularization of Counter-Strike as a competitive game became the creation of esports. Without Counter-Strike, esports I think would be a very different thing than what it is today. Following Counter-Strike, in November 2004, Halo 2, with Chris Butcher as lead multiplayer engineer, massively transformed how players connect to multiplayer games, and it pioneered automatic matchmaking. Prior to this, the PC world was accustomed to scrolling through complex, heavily populated server browser lists, which for console players was tedious, clunky, unintuitive, and Bungie saw this, and Chris Butcher built a system where players could literally select a playlist and then click one button, and then in the background an algorithm would use an ELO style true skill sort of ranking for the players to sort of put them together in what could be considered a fairer method, and then this algorithm would get the match created, ensure that latency and ping between players was fair, and then would take you into the game. It was frictionless, it revolutionized console gaming, it established sort of a modern standard for nearly all future multiplayer titles. And then it was the slow, quiet death march of tight-knit, community-run dedicated servers. They still exist in some spaces, but basically every game since Halo 2 has been, if it's been multiplayer, it's had stupid simple matchmaking. To some people, that is the best thing. To some people, it's not. A lot of us do miss the old community servers and being able to pick your own community server to go and play on. And some of us prefer not having to think about it, and letting the server decide how to put players together. But regardless of how you feel about sort of this march towards really simple matchmaking, nonetheless, it was revolutionary. It invited so many people to be able to enjoy the hobby. Okay, last section. The last section is sort of where we are now. The concept of matchmaking has come about now. The concept of simplicity and being able to join a multiplayer game whenever and wherever, all these things have sort of been worked out now. So starting from 2007, we get the birth of a new genre in the multiplayer space with Team Fortress 2. So October 2007, Robin Walker and John Cook, who were sort of the co-creators of TF2, working at Valve, TF2 pioneered and sort of birthed the concept of this class-based shooter, which would eventually go on to create the hero shooter. But its most profound legacy occurred in June 2011, and at that time, Valve transitioned the game from a paid game to free-to-play, which is where CSGO is now today. CS2, is now today. This shift necessitated the creation of massive, globally distributed back-end database infrastructure. The Steam inventory service to securely track, authenticate, and process millions of microtransactions, and then real-time trades within the classic hat economy of old TF2. It was released on consoles, but the connection with Steam on the PC side made it last a lot longer on the PC than on any of the consoles. And then, of course, after TF2 in 2016, so not even 10 years between the creation of TF2 and Overwatch, in May of 2016, Jeff Kaplan, who was a game director working at Blizzard, they released Overwatch for PC and the consoles at the time. And they basically took the TF2 foundation and built upon it. Overwatch heavily polished the class-based, highly synergized competitive format. It supported intricate, chaotic combinations of projectile physics, hit scan weapons, and localized area of effect abilities. Blizzard had to engineer highly optimized, bespoke server architectures that were capable of managing just incredibly complex state validations, and they had to ensure minimal latency to ensure the sort of tight competitive integrity that Overwatch would need to become an esport, which it eventually did. And I believe Overwatch is still to this day an esport. And that's very much thanks to Blizzard's expertise in server infrastructure that they got when they were making World of Warcraft and still working on World of Warcraft. They have some of the best server engineers in the world, so creating Overwatch was definitely a challenge, but they definitely had a really good head start with all of the existing experience that their teams had. Now, moving on from the hero shooter, you have the Battle Royale explosion. You have, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. This was December of 2017 for the 1.0 release. Brennan Green, who was otherwise known as PlayerUnknown, creative director for the PUBG Corporation. And then Fortnite Battle Royale, which was released in September of 2017. I can't remember if I got the Fortnite date or the Battle Royale date, but either way, Epic Games added Battle Royale to Fortnite, which was a game they had already created that was not doing well, and adding Battle Royale massively helped. They made it free to play. PUBG, I believe at the time, it may even still be, a paid game. So Epic Games, really, still to this day, has massively benefited from it. And of course, there's also a live service, but we'll get into live service in a second. But yeah, so when Brennan Green, PlayerUnknown, he basically made a survival mod for Armor. It was either that or Daisy. I'm pretty sure it was Armor. So he took this mod, which was the sort of first version of this Battlegrounds concept, of this Battle Royale concept, and then he turned it into its own independent game. And when he did that, Fortnite went, "Oh, that's a really cool idea," and added it to the game that was failing. Epic Games took it and added it to the game that was failing. Battle Royale presents a monumental networking and infrastructure challenge because it has the sort of scale of almost like an MMO, but with the requirement of highly competitive play. You're synchronizing 100 live players in a massive physics simulated open world required ridiculously elastic cloud architecture. This leveraged basically enterprise level networks like AWS and Azure to dynamically spin up server instances on demand, to maintain game states in order to prevent servers from buckling under the sheer volume of data. The developers implemented really aggressive network culling. Basically, relevancy. What did the player need to see? And spatial partitioning algorithms. So, instead of broadcasting every player's location to the entire lobby, it would only send you information about players, ballistics, physics objects that were immediately within your proximity or within your field of view. This combined with aggressive level of detail scaling, filtered the data and saved crucial bandwidth, and prevented server and client bottlenecking during the early game of any round, where you have the hundreds of players and they're all interacting with each other and they're all doing their own independent thing. And with Fortnite especially, Fortnite now has become so big that Fortnite makes so much money now. It's so popular that it has really changed the industry. It has made the industry much more desperate for their own cash cow, for their own live service. Not to put down the technical achievement that is Fortnite, the popularity of the game has almost certainly changed the direction of the gaming industry for, if not forever, for at least a considerable while now, and will continue to do so for at least a decent amount of time, for good and for bad. I think there could be a great game in the live service genre, but they really are very few and far between. And right now, the whole gaming industry sort of feels like it's aiming towards making their own version of Fortnite, their own version of a live service. But we'll see. We'll see how well that goes for us. So the final sort of takeaway in this is, after looking back at 30 years of technological evolution, the architectural shift in multiplayer gaming reveals sort of this really grim reality. A lot of the freedom of community-owned dedicated servers, infinitely replayable local LAN games, the ability to host your own server locally, and the prevalence of always online DRM and these almost predatory bell pass systems that have sort of consumed the minds of so many gaming company CEOs. It feels like there's more and more issues when it comes to multiplayer than there are benefits. Modern matchmaking algorithms really no longer purely focus on ping and fair skill distribution. They have become complex, telemetry-driven engines that are highly designed to maximize, playtime, player retention, the sort of psychological, parasocial engagement of players, and microtransactions have become so synonymous in this industry now that it feels less like games are trying to be purely entertainment and more that they're trying to be purely monetizable and purely corporate. Ultimately, because a lot of these modern game clients are incredibly hollow bits of software, they have to have these continuous handshakes with proprietary backend APIs. Some of them are just basically web browsers at this point, and a lot of the digital ownership of these games are really dead. If a publisher decides that an online game is no longer profitable, and pulls the plug, then the games that you own all of a sudden disappear. Sorry, I see someone outside. Looks like they're surrendering, but they're not. They're cleaning their window. Anyway, got a bit sad there at the end, but it's important to keep the core thing, these core ideas in mind when you decide to play a game that's multiplayer, when you decide to play something that might be actively trying to get money from you and be trying to actively trick you into spending more time than you want playing the game. The modern experience of multiplayer sort of, after looking into it, has me reeling for the days of simple multiplayer, of simple cooperative and games that felt like they wanted to provide me with entertainment rather than provide me with a service or a product. It is sad in a way that this is where gaming is now. It feels like a lot of this industry is stuck in this death spiral, going after the live service unicorn, when gamers would probably almost certainly prefer games that respected them and their time, that were just entertainment, were just fun. But anyway, that is enough from me. I'm starting to rant, and I should avoid that for sake of longevity, for sake of succinctness, and making sure we get through things in a timely manner, not to waste your time. So yeah, as mentioned at the top of the show, if you want to learn more about networking, check out Network Chuck. Here's some great videos. They're definitely more technical and less focused on gaming, but an excellent channel nonetheless, with some great learning to be had. Alright, well, that's basically all for us. Let me know down in the comments, what's a multiplayer game that you sort of, you reel for, you sort of long to have another go, to let the sort of the will of the community come back to it and rebirth it. I know I was recently playing Left 4 Dead 2, which is the co-op campaign, which I was playing through with one of my mates, and we had never properly played through it, and we've been quite enjoying it. It's definitely got some some sharp edges and some annoyances, but nonetheless, it's still very well made and still quite a lot of fun. And yeah, it's a really simple multiplayer, and it's the sort of thing I miss. I wish we had more games like that. But yeah, let me know. Is there a particular game that you would love to see have a sort of second chance at life? Or is there a particular like multiplayer style that you'd like to see come back around and yeah, have another go? Right, well, as always, fumble.nz if you want an alternative to the Humble store. It's really fun, really cool. Lots of games on there, adding more stuff to that all the time, so check that out. And Kevin MacLeod, if any music you heard today is probably his, you can find his work at Incompetech. $38 US, you can get basically all of his songs, and you support an artist who creates music for the Creative Commons that you've almost certainly heard before. So, an excellent guy, and yeah, go support him. Alright, well, that is all. This may be a slightly longer episode. I have to edit it down, so I'll find out. But yes, thank you very much for watching. Have a great rest of your day, and ta-ra.